Jeremiah McKenna had one simple plan when he rode into Deadwood that morning: trade his winter pelts for enough whiskey to last the cold months ahead. The mountain man had lived alone in his cabin for 15 years, speaking only to his horse and the occasional trader brave enough to venture into the high country. But as he approached the town square, the sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. A woman, barely more than skin and bones, stood chained to a wooden post while men shouted bids for her like she was livestock. Her face bore fresh bruises, and her eyes held the hollow look of someone who had given up hope. Without thinking, Jeremiah reached for his coin purse. But what happens when a man who has forgotten how to trust must teach a broken woman to believe in kindness again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. What am I bid for this fine specimen? She's young, strong enough for field work, and already broken in proper. Jeremiah's jaw clenched as he studied the woman more closely. She couldn't be more than 25, with auburn hair matted and tangled around her shoulders. The iron shackles around her wrists had worn raw wounds into her skin, and her dress, once perhaps a respectable blue calico, hung in tatters that barely preserved her modesty. $50, called out a heavy-set man in a bowler hat, tobacco juice staining his beard. 60, countered another, this one missing most of his teeth. The woman, Clara, the auctioneer had called her, stood perfectly still, but Jeremiah could see the slight tremor in her hands. Her eyes had fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, as if she could will herself to disappear entirely. 75, Jeremiah heard himself say, his voice carrying across the square with quiet authority. The crowd turned to look at him, taking in his worn buckskins, the long rifle slung across his back, and the thick black beard that hadn't seen scissors in months. Most stepped aside instinctively, recognizing a man who lived by different rules than townfolk. Well now, the auctioneer grinned, sensing an opportunity. The mountain man's interested. Do I hear 80? 100? The heavy-set man called out, his eyes narrowing as he looked Jeremiah up and down. Jeremiah felt the weight of his leather coin purse against his hip, his entire winter's earnings from trapping, enough to buy supplies, ammunition, and yes, the whiskey that would help him endure another long winter alone in his cabin. But looking at Clara's hollow expression, he realized some things mattered more than personal comfort. 200, he said simply. A hush fell over the crowd. $200 was more money than most of these men saw in a year. The heavy-set man cursed under his breath and shook his head, backing away from the bidding. 200 going once, the auctioneer called out, barely containing his excitement. Going twice. He paused, scanning the crowd for any other bids. Sold to the mountain man. Jeremiah approached the platform, pulling out his coin purse with deliberate movements. The leather was soft from years of handling, worn smooth by countless transactions in trading posts and settlements. As he counted out the gold pieces, each coin represented days of cold mornings, checking trap lines, nights spent skinning pelts by lamplight, months of solitude in pursuit of this moment's payment. The auctioneer bit each coin to test its authenticity before nodding his approval. She's all yours, friend. Key to the shackles is 50 cents extra. 50 cents, Jeremiah repeated slowly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that made the auctioneer take a step back. Or free, the man quickly amended, producing a small iron key from his vest pocket. Jeremiah climbed onto the platform, acutely aware of Clara's sharp intake of breath as he approached. Up close, he could see that her eyes were the color of deep forest shadows, and despite everything she'd endured, intelligence still flickered behind her fear. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, holding up the key so she could see it. "My name is Jeremiah McKenna. I live up in the high country, and I'm going to take you away from here." Clara's eyes darted from his face to the key and back again. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, roughened by thirst and disuse. Why? It was a fair question, and one Jeremiah wasn't entirely sure he could answer. Why had he just spent his life savings on a stranger? Why had he abandoned his simple plan for whiskey and winter supplies? Because no person should be sold like livestock, he said finally, reaching for the shackles around her wrists. And because sometimes a man has to choose between what's easy and what's right. The iron shackles fell away with a metallic clatter, leaving angry red marks on her pale skin. Clara stared down at her freed hands, as if she couldn't quite believe they were her own again. "Can you ride?" Jeremiah asked. She nodded slowly. "Then we're leaving. Now." As they walked toward his horse, Jeremiah could feel the weight of watching eyes from the crowd. Some looked curious, others disappointed that the entertainment was over. A few appeared calculating, as if they were already planning how to follow and reclaim what they saw as stolen property. Clara moved carefully, each step deliberate and measured. 15 years of mountain living had taught Jeremiah to read people like he read weather patterns. And everything about this woman told him she was far from broken, despite appearances. Beneath the fear and exhaustion, he sensed a core of steel that her captors had been unable to bend. They rode out of Deadwood in silence, Clara perched behind Jeremiah on his sturdy bay mare. She held herself rigid, maintaining as much distance as possible while still staying on the horse. Every few minutes, he felt her glance back toward the town, and he wondered if she was having second thoughts about leaving with a stranger. The trail wound upward through pine and aspen, following a creek that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. Jeremiah had traveled this route countless times, but having another person with him made him see it differently. The beauty that usually soothed his spirit now seemed fragile, vulnerable to the darkness that followed civilized places. When they stopped to water the horse at a natural pool, Clara slid down without waiting for his help. She knelt by the water's edge and cupped her hands, drinking deeply before splashing the cool liquid on her face and neck. For the first time since the auction, some of the tension seemed to leave her shoulders. "There's jerky in my saddlebags if you're hungry," Jeremiah offered, keeping his voice gentle. She nodded but didn't move toward the food. Instead, she reached into the torn pocket of her dress and pulled out something small, holding it close to her chest. In the brief moment before she tucked it away again, Jeremiah caught a glimpse of what looked like a worn photograph. "How far to your cabin?" she asked, still not looking at him directly. "We'll make camp tonight. Reach it by midday tomorrow." He studied her pale face, noting the dark circles under her eyes. "When did you last have a proper meal?" Clara's laugh held no humor. "I stopped counting the days a long time ago." As the sun began to set, Jeremiah selected a campsite in a grove of cottonwoods, sheltered by large rocks that would hide their fire from casual observation. He'd learned caution during his years in the mountains, and something about the way certain men had looked at Clara in town made his instincts prickle with warning. While he gathered firewood and tended to his horse, Clara sat motionless on a fallen log, staring into the growing dark. The photograph had appeared in her hands again, and she traced its edges with one finger, as if memorizing its texture. "My family," she said suddenly, noticing his curious glance. "This is all I have left of them." Jeremiah fed dry branches into the small fire he'd built, choosing his words carefully. "Where are they now?" "Dead." The word fell like a stone into still water. "Cholera took my parents 3 years ago. My brother died fighting for the Union. I was teaching school in a settlement called Pine Ridge when the raiders came through." She fell silent again, but Jeremiah waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. "They killed everyone who resisted," she continued, her voice distant. "Burned the school with my books still inside. Said women like me were worth more alive than dead, so they kept a few of us to sell in the bigger towns." The fire crackled between them, and Jeremiah felt a familiar rage building in his chest. He'd seen the aftermath of such raids before, entire communities destroyed by men who viewed other human beings as nothing more than commodities to be traded. "How long?" he asked. 2 years, maybe 3. Time gets strange when you're—" She shook her head, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. Jeremiah stood and walked to his saddlebags, returning with a tin cup and a small bottle. He poured a measure of whiskey and held it out to her. Clara looked at the cup suspiciously. "I don't drink spirits, it's medicine," he said simply. "Help you sleep without dreams." She accepted the cup, but didn't drink immediately. "Why did you buy me, Jeremiah McKenna? And don't tell me it was just because it was the right thing to do. Men don't spend their life savings on strangers without a reason." It was a fair question, and one he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd opened his mouth to bid. "My sister was taken by Comancheros when she was 16, he said finally. "Never found her. Never knew what happened. Maybe helping you helps her somehow." Clara studied his face in the firelight, searching for deception and finding none. "What if I run away in the night? You'd lose everything you spent on me." "You're not my property," Jeremiah replied. "You're free to go whenever you choose. But where would you run to? Those men in town, some of them will be wondering if they can take you from one mountain man, living alone." As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed from the trail below. Jeremiah was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, motioning for Clara to move behind the rocks. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, their faces hard and purposeful in the firelight. "Evening, friend," called the leader, a thin man with cold eyes. "Saw you leave town with some valuable cargo. Thought we might discuss a business proposition." Jeremiah kept his rifle trained on the 3 men while his mind calculated distances and angles. The leader sat easy in his saddle, but the other 2 had their hands resting on their gun butts. Professional killers, from the look of them. "Not interested in any business tonight, gentlemen," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man comfortable with violence. "Suggest you move along?" The thin man smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Now that's unfriendly. We just want to make you a fair offer for that woman you bought, save you the trouble of breaking her in yourself. The woman's not for sale. Everything's for sale at the right price. We'll give you what you paid, plus $50 for your trouble." Clara remained hidden behind the rocks, but Jeremiah could sense her terror, radiating like heat from a forge. These weren't random opportunists. They'd followed specifically for her, which meant there was more to her story than she'd revealed. "Final time," Jeremiah said, chambering around. "Ride away." The leader's smile faded. "There's 3 of us and 1 of you, mountain man. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. 3 of you, 1 of me." Jeremiah agreed. "Means I only get to kill 3 men tonight instead of more." Something in his tone made the horses shift nervously. The leader's eyes narrowed as he reassessed the situation, taking in Jeremiah's steady hands, the way he held his rifle like it was part of his body, the complete absence of fear in his posture. "You know what, boys?" the leader said after a long moment. "Maybe we should let this one slide. Mountain Man's got himself a woman. That's his business." But as the 3 men turned their horses to leave, Jeremiah caught the subtle hand signal the leader gave to his companions. They'd be back, probably before dawn, hoping to catch them sleeping. After the hoofbeats faded, Clara emerged from behind the rocks, her face pale in the firelight. "They'll return, won't they?" "Most likely." Jeremiah began gathering their supplies. "We need to move. There's a place I know about 2 hours' ride north. Defensible ground." "They weren't random bandits," Clara said as she helped him pack. "They knew who I was." Jeremiah paused in his work, studying her face. "Something you need to tell me." Clara hesitated, then reached for her photograph again. But this time she held it out so he could see it clearly. The image showed a younger version of Clara, standing beside a well-dressed man in front of what appeared to be a substantial house. "My husband," she said quietly, "Marcus Whitfield. He owned the largest general store in Pine Ridge, had interests in 3 other towns. When the raiders came, they weren't just looking for women to sell. They were looking for me specifically." "Why?" "Marcus kept detailed records of everyone he did business with, including some men who didn't want their transactions made public. Before he died, he hid those records and told me where to find them. The raiders think I know where Marcus kept evidence of their illegal dealings." Jeremiah felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "Do you?" Yes, Clara folded the photograph carefully and tucked it back into her dress. The records are hidden in a safety deposit box in Denver. Marcus made me memorize the bank name and box number in case something ever happened to him. What kind of illegal dealings? Gun running, most selling weapons to renegade tribes, then selling information about the raids to the army. Marcus discovered they were playing both sides, profiting from the violence they helped create. Jeremiah whistled low. That's worth killing for. All right, and these men think you can lead them to evidence that would see them hanged. They mounted up and rode north through the darkness, following game trails that would be difficult to track. Clara rode behind him again, but this time she held on when the terrain grew rough, her survival instincts overriding her earlier fear of physical contact. The place Jeremiah had in mind was a narrow canyon with only one way in or out, sheltered by overhanging rocks that would provide cover and muffle the sound of gunfire. He'd used it before when tracking wounded elk, and it had the advantage of being invisible from the main trail. As they made camp in the protected space, Clara helped him gather stones for a fire ring without being asked. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, and Jeremiah realized that beneath her genteel appearance lived a woman who'd learned to adapt quickly to harsh circumstances. "You said you were a teacher," he observed, as she arranged kindling with practiced hands. "For 7 years. But you learn practical skills when you're married to a frontier merchant." Marcus believed a woman should know how to take care of herself. She looked up at him with something that might have been the beginning of trust. Looks like he was right. The attack came just before dawn, as Jeremiah had predicted. He'd been awake for an hour, watching the narrow entrance to their canyon hideout, while Clara slept fitfully against the rock wall. The first hint of trouble was his horse's ears pricking forward, followed by the soft scrape of boot leather against stone. Jeremiah touched Clara's shoulder gently, and her eyes opened immediately. No grogginess, no confusion. 2 years of captivity had taught her to wake ready for danger. "They're here," he whispered, pointing toward the canyon mouth. "Stay low and keep that fire between you and the entrance." He'd positioned his hunting rifle against a natural rock rest during the night, with clear sightlines across the narrow opening. The weapon was a sharp spetmawak, 50 caliber, that could drop a buffalo at 300 yards. At this distance, it would punch through a man like he was made of paper. The first man appeared at the canyon entrance, moving cautiously with his pistol drawn. Jeremiah let him advance 10 feet before putting a bullet through his chest. The crack of the rifle echoed off the stone walls like thunder, and the man dropped without making a sound. "Whitfield," the thin leader's voice called from outside the canyon. "We know you're in there. Send out the woman, and we'll let you ride away." "Afraid I can't do that," Jeremiah called back, already reloading. "But I'm willing to discuss terms for your surrender." A bullet spanged off the rock near his head, followed by the boom of a heavy revolver. Jeremiah smiled grimly. They were shooting blind, hoping to get lucky. He had all the advantages: cover, concealment, and superior firepower. The second man tried to rush the entrance while Jeremiah was presumably pinned down by covering fire. It was a brave attempt, but poorly executed. Jeremiah put him down with a shot that echoed across the mountains like a clap of thunder. "That's 2 of your boys dead," Jeremiah shouted. "You want to join them, or would you prefer to ride away and try your luck somewhere else?" Silence stretched for several minutes. Then came the sound of a single horse riding away at full gallop. The thin leader had apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor, at least for now. Clara emerged from behind the fire, her face pale but determined. "Is it over?" "For now." Jeremiah kept his rifle ready as he moved to check the bodies. "But he'll be back with more men. We need to reach my cabin and prepare for a longer fight." They broke camp quickly and resumed their journey up the mountain trail. The landscape grew wilder as they climbed, towering pines giving way to spruce and aspen, then bare rock and alpine meadows. Clara rode in silence, but Jeremiah noticed she no longer flinched when he moved suddenly or spoke without warning. His cabin sat in a natural bowl surrounded by steep ridges, accessible by only one narrow trail that switched back up the mountainside. It was a defensive position he'd chosen deliberately after his first winter in the high country, when wolves and worse predators had taught him the value of controlling access to his territory. The structure itself was solid. Thick log walls chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney and small windows that could serve as gun ports if necessary. Behind the cabin, a natural spring provided fresh water year-round, and the surrounding slopes offered excellent hunting and multiple escape routes for someone who knew the terrain. Clara dismounted and studied the building with professional interest. "How long did this take you to build?" "3 seasons. Had to haul most of the logs up by hand." Jeremiah unsaddled his horse and led it to a small corral he'd built near the spring. "Not much to look at, but it's home. It's beautiful," Clara said, and he could hear the sincerity in her voice. Peaceful. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished, but scrupulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, flanked by shelves holding books, tools, and supplies. A narrow bed occupied one corner, and a simple table and chairs sat beneath the front window. Everything spoke of a man who valued function over comfort, but took pride in his craftsmanship. Clara ran her fingers along the smooth wood of the table. "You made this yourself. Most everything here. Not much else to do during the long winter." Jeremiah began checking his weapons and ammunition supplies. "There's a root cellar out back with preserved food, and the spring never freezes. We can hold out here for weeks if we need to." "We?" Clara looked at him with raised eyebrow. Jeremiah paused in his inventory, realizing what he'd implied. "I mean, if you want to stay, you're free to leave any time you choose, but those men won't give up easy, and there's nowhere safe for you to go until we deal with them permanently." Clara walked to the window and looked out at the spectacular view of the valley below. "What you're really saying is that I've brought trouble to your sanctuary. Trouble finds me whether I look for it or not." Jeremiah replied, "At least this time, I'm fighting for something worthwhile." Over the following days, an unexpected routine developed between them. Clara proved surprisingly adept at mountain life, helping with daily tasks without being asked and showing no squeamishness about the realities of frontier living. She cleaned fish, tended the fire, and even helped Jeremiah repair a section of the cabin's roof that had been damaged by winter storms. In the evenings, after they'd eaten and secured the cabin for the night, Clara would produce a leather-bound book from her dress pocket, a volume of poetry she'd somehow managed to keep hidden throughout her captivity. The pages were worn soft from handling, and many passages were marked with pencil notations in her neat handwriting. "Would you like me to read aloud?" she asked one evening, settling into the chair across from him by the firelight. Jeremiah looked up from cleaning his rifle. "Not much for poetry. That's because you've probably never heard it read properly." Clara opened the book to a marked page. "This is Wordsworth, 'I wandered lonely as a cloud.' It's about finding beauty in simple things." Her voice transformed as she began to read, taking on a musical quality that filled the small cabin with unexpected warmth. Jeremiah found himself listening not just to the words, but to the way she spoke them, with passion and understanding that revealed depths he was only beginning to appreciate. "That was," he paused, searching for the right word, "different than I expected." Clara smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. Poetry isn't about fancy words. It's about capturing feelings that are too big for ordinary conversation. "Like what?" "Like the way this place makes me feel." She gestured toward the window, where stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. "Safe, but also free. As if I could finally breathe after holding my breath for years." Jeremiah set down his rifle and really looked at her for the first time. In the gentle firelight, with her hair cleaned and braided and some color returned to her cheeks, Clara was undeniably beautiful, but more than that, she was present in a way she hadn't been since he'd first seen her on that auction platform. "What did you teach?" he asked. "Before, everything. Reading, writing, arithmetic, history, geography. In a small settlement like Pine Ridge, the school teacher handles all subjects for all ages." Clara closed the book, but kept it in her lap. I loved it. Watching children discover that letters could become words, words could become stories, stories could become doorways to anywhere they wanted to go. Must have been hard to lose that. Harder than losing my husband. If I'm honest, Marcus was a good man, but he was much older than me. Our marriage was more companionship than passion. But teaching, that was my calling. Jeremiah found himself curious about her life before the tragedy. How did you end up in Pine Ridge? My parents sent me there after I finished normal school. They thought a teaching position would be good preparation for marriage and motherhood. But I fell in love with the work itself, not just what it was supposed to prepare me for. And then you met Marcus. He was on the school board, 43 years old, widowed, no children of his own. He needed a wife to help with his business entertaining, and I needed security. It wasn't romantic, but it was practical. Clara's fingers traced the book's cover absently. He encouraged my reading, even bought me books from Denver, said an educated wife reflected well on a man's success. Sounds like he respected you. He did. That's more than many women get. Clara looked up at him suddenly. What about you? Ever married? Jeremiah shook his head. Came close once. Girl named Sarah in a settlement down near Colorado Springs, but she wanted things I couldn't give her. Regular income, social standing, life in town where she could visit with other women. So you chose the mountains instead. Seemed like the only choice at the time. Sometimes I wonder if I was just too stubborn to compromise. Clara was quiet for a moment, studying his face in the firelight. Were you in love with her? The question surprised him with its directness. I thought I was. Looking back, I think I was more in love with the idea of having someone to share my life with. And now I understand the difference. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Clara's cheeks flushed slightly, but she didn't look away. Jeremiah, she said softly, what happens when this is over? When those men are no longer a threat? That's up to you. You're free to go wherever you want. Do whatever you choose. And if I chose to stay, he met her eyes directly, then I'd count myself the luckiest man in these mountains. Their peaceful interlude shattered on a crisp morning, when Jeremiah returned from checking his trap lines to find Clara pressed against the cabin wall, peering cautiously around the corner toward the corral. 4 men, she whispered as he approached. They came up the back trail while you were gone. I managed to get inside and bar the door, but they're still out there. Jeremiah cursed under his breath. He'd been so focused on watching the main approach that he'd failed to consider someone might scout alternative routes up the mountain. It was a rookie mistake that could cost them everything. Where exactly? He asked, pulling out his brass compass to orient himself. 2 by the spring, 1 near the woodpile, another behind the big pine to the east. They're not making any effort to hide, want us to know they're there. Through a gap in the logs, Jeremiah could see part of the situation. These weren't the same men from the canyon fight. These were professionals, well-armed and patient, positioned to cover all the cabin's exits. Someone had been watching his routines, learning his habits. Clara Whitfield, a voice called from outside. My name is Colonel Morrison. I represent certain business interests that were associates of your late husband. We'd like to discuss a mutually beneficial arrangement. Clara went rigid at the name. Morrison, she whispered. Marcus mentioned him. He was the one coordinating the gun sales to the tribes. We know you have information we need, Morrison continued, and we're prepared to compensate you generously for your cooperation. But our patience isn't unlimited. Jeremiah checked his ammunition supply. Enough for a sustained fight, but not enough to take on 4 professional killers in open ground. They needed to change the terms of engagement. I have an idea, he said quietly to Clara, but I need you to trust me completely. What kind of idea? There's a cave system about a 1/4 mile up the ridge. Connects to 3 different exits, all of them hidden from casual view. If we can reach it, we can disappear long enough to plan a proper counterattack. Clara looked skeptical. How do we get there without being seen? We don't. We make them think we're trying to surrender, then run when their guard is down. That sounds like a terrible plan. Jeremiah grinned, despite their situation. Sometimes terrible plans work because nobody expects them. He moved to the front window and called out, "Morrison, we're willing to talk, but not with guns pointed at us. Have your men pull back 50 yards and we'll come out to discuss terms. You're not in a position to negotiate, mountain man. Nor are you. This cabin's built like a fort, and we've got supplies to last a month. You want to sit out here in the cold that long?" A long pause followed, then Morrison's voice again. "Very well, we'll pull back. But any tricks, and the woman dies first." Through chinks in the logs, they watched as the four men withdrew to positions that offered clear fields of fire, but were far enough away to suggest good faith. "When I open the door," Jeremiah whispered, "walk out slowly with your hands visible. Count to 10, then run for the big boulder to your left. Stay low and don't look back." "What about you? I'll be right behind you." Clara nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear of dying, but fear of trusting someone else with her survival, after 2 years of depending only on herself. Jeremiah unbarred the door and stepped out first, his rifle held loosely in one hand.
"Morrison, which one are you in?" A tall man with silver hair and a military bearing stepped forward. "I am, and you must be the fool who thinks he can protect something that doesn't belong to him. Everything belongs to someone, Colonel. Question is whether you're willing to kill for it, if necessary."
Clara emerged from the cabin, moving with careful deliberation. Jeremiah could sense her coiled tension, like a spring wound too tight. "Now," he barked, diving to his right as Clara sprinted toward the boulder. The clearing erupted in gunfire. Jeremiah rolled behind the woodpile as bullets splintered the logs where he'd been standing. Clara reached her cover safely, but now they were pinned down in separate positions with 50 yards of open ground between them. "You've made a serious mistake, mountain man," Morrison shouted. "Now we do this the hard way." But Jeremiah was already moving, using his knowledge of every rock and tree on his property to work his way toward Clara's position. The cave entrance was directly above the boulder where she'd taken shelter. If they could reach it, they might just survive long enough to turn the tables on their pursuers. The cave entrance was barely wide enough for one person, hidden behind a curtain of hanging pine branches that Jeremiah had carefully arranged years earlier. He and Clara squeezed through just as Morrison's men began their assault on the cabin, apparently believing their quarry was still trapped inside. "This way," Jeremiah whispered, pulling out his steel fire striker and a piece of charcloth. The brief spark illuminated a narrow tunnel that descended into the mountain's heart. Clara followed without hesitation, though he could hear her sharp intake of breath when the darkness closed around them completely. They moved by feel, Jeremiah's hand trailing along the smooth stone wall while Clara kept one palm on his shoulder for guidance. "How far?" she whispered. "Quarter mile, maybe more." The tunnel connects to an old mine shaft that comes out near the tree line. Behind them, the sound of gunfire continued as Morrison's men discovered the empty cabin. Jeremiah smiled grimly, imagining their frustration as they realized their quarry had vanished. The tunnel branched several times, but Jeremiah knew each fork from years of exploration. He'd used this route before when tracking wounded elk, and once to escape a late spring blizzard that had caught him away from home. They emerged from the mountainside into pale afternoon sunlight, the cave mouth concealed behind a screen of scrub oak and mountain mahogany. Below them, they could see smoke rising from the direction of Jeremiah's cabin. "They're burning it," Clara said, her voice heavy with guilt. "Your home, everything you built. It's just wood and stone." Jeremiah studied the terrain, planning their next move. "What matters is we're alive and free." But privately he felt the loss like a physical wound. That cabin had been his sanctuary for 15 years, the place where he'd learned to live with solitude and find peace in simple routine. Now it was ash and memory, destroyed because he'd chosen to help a stranger. Clara seemed to read his thoughts. "I'm sorry, if you hadn't what? Gotten yourself captured and sold like livestock. That wasn't your choice." Jeremiah shouldered his rifle and began picking his way down through the rocks. "You need to find shelter before nightfall. There's another place I know, but it's a hard climb. They spent the rest of the day working their way along deer trails and ridgelines, staying well above the valleys where Morrison's men might be searching. Clara proved surprisingly resilient, keeping pace despite her soft shoes and long skirt. When she stumbled on loose scree, she got up without complaint and continued climbing. By evening, they reached Jeremiah's destination, a shallow overhang that provided protection from wind and rain, while remaining invisible from below. He'd cached supplies here years earlier: blankets, dried food, ammunition, and a small pot for melting snow. "How many places like this do you have?" Clara asked as she helped him arrange their meager camp. "Half a dozen, scattered across maybe 50 square miles. Always pays to have options in country like this." As darkness fell, they huddled together under the shared blankets, not from desire but from necessity. The October night was bitter cold at this altitude, and their shared body heat was essential for survival. "Jeremiah," Clara said softly, "tell me about your sister." He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Finally he spoke. Her name was Rebecca. Sweet girl, always laughing, always getting into mischief. She was gathering berries with some other children when the raiders hit. By the time we found the signs, they were 2 days gone. How old were you? 19. Thought I was man enough to track them, get her back. Followed their trail for 3 weeks before I lost it in a thunderstorm. His voice carried old pain. Carefully controlled, found out later they'd sold her somewhere in Mexico. Could be anywhere by now, or more likely dead. Clara pressed closer to him, offering what comfort she could. "Is that why you came to the mountains? To get away from the memories?" "Partly. Also couldn't stand the way people looked at me afterward, like I'd failed at the one thing that mattered most. You were 19 years old, outnumbered by professional raiders. What could you have done?" "I don't know. Something. Anything." Jeremiah stared up at the star-filled sky. "Maybe that's why I bought you. Chance to save someone this time." "You did save me. You're still saving me." They lay in silence after that, listening to the wind in the pines and the distant howl of wolves. Clara's breathing gradually slowed and deepened, but Jeremiah remained awake, planning their next moves and wondering how long they could survive as fugitives in their own mountains. Somewhere in the darkness below, Morrison and his men were probably making similar plans. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, and Jeremiah wasn't sure his wilderness skills would be enough to protect them both from enemies who seemed to have unlimited resources and patience. Clara woke before dawn, shivering despite the shared warmth of their makeshift shelter. Her fever had begun sometime during the night, first as a slight chill, then progressing to alternating waves of heat and cold that left her disoriented and weak. "I'm fine," she insisted when Jeremiah noticed her flushed cheeks and glassy eyes, "just tired from yesterday's climb." But by mid-morning, as they worked their way down toward a natural spring, Jeremiah knew, Clara was stumbling frequently and breathing hard from exertion that shouldn't have winded her. When she finally collapsed beside a fallen log, unable to go any further, Jeremiah felt genuine fear for the first time since the gunfight. "It's the exposure," he said, pressing his palm to her burning forehead. "Your body's been through hell for 2 years, and now it's trying to shut down." Clara tried to stand and swayed dangerously. "We have to keep moving. Morrison's men can go to hell." Jeremiah swept her up in his arms, carrying her the remaining 100 yards to the spring. "Right now, you're what matters." He made camp in a grove of aspen trees, whose golden leaves provided natural camouflage. Using skills learned from years of treating his own injuries and illnesses in the wilderness, Jeremiah began fighting for Clara's life with the same determination he'd shown in fighting their human enemy. First, he got her out of her damp, torn dress and wrapped her in every blanket and piece of clothing he could spare. Then he built a careful fire, hot enough to provide warmth, but small enough to avoid detection, and began heating water for willow bark tea, nature's aspirin for reducing fever. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering incoherently about her students in Pine Ridge, sometimes calling for her dead husband. During her lucid moments, she tried to apologize for slowing them down, but Jeremiah silenced her with gentle words and steady care. "Drink this," he said, supporting her head while she sipped the bitter willow bark tea. "I know it tastes awful, but it'll help with the fever." On the second day, when her temperature spiked dangerously high, Jeremiah made the desperate decision to strip both of them and lie skin to skin under the blankets, using his body heat to regulate hers when she couldn't control her own temperature. It was intimate in a way that transcended physical desire, two people clinging to life in the most elemental sense. "Don't you dare die on me," he whispered fiercely when her breathing became shallow and rapid. "I didn't spend my life savings on you just to watch you give up now." Clara's eyes fluttered open, focusing on his face with effort. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." "I know enough," Jeremiah said, smoothing damp hair back from her forehead. "I know you're brave enough to survive 2 years of hell. I know you're kind enough to worry about my feelings when you should be focused on getting well. I know you make me want to be a better man than I've been for the past 15 years. Jeremiah," her voice was barely a whisper, "if I don't make it, you're going to make it. If I don't," she continued stubbornly, "the bank in Denver is First National. Box number 20. The key is sewn into the lining of my dress pocket." He found the key exactly where she'd said, a small piece of brass that felt heavy with significance in his palm. But he tucked it away without examination, refusing to accept that she might not recover to use it herself. By the third day, Clara's fever broke. She woke to find herself pressed against Jeremiah's chest, his arms holding her protectively even in sleep. For the first time in 2 years, she felt completely safe. "Good morning," she said softly. Jeremiah's eyes opened immediately, alert and concerned. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a horse, but alive." Clara smiled weakly. "Thank you for everything. Thank me by getting your strength back. We still have work to do." As Clara recovered over the following days, something fundamental had changed between them. The careful politeness was gone, replaced by an intimacy born of shared vulnerability. They talked about their fears, their dreams, their regrets. Jeremiah told her about his loneliness in the mountains, how he'd sometimes go weeks without hearing his own voice. Clara described the numbness that had protected her during captivity, and how being with him was teaching her to feel again. On the evening when she was finally strong enough to sit up and eat solid food, Clara found a small wildflower growing near their camp. Despite the approaching winter, it bloomed defiantly among the rocks, a splash of purple beauty in the harsh landscape. She picked it carefully and pressed it between the pages of her poetry book. "For remembering," she said when Jeremiah asked why. "Remembering what?" "The moment I decided to live again." Once Clara regained her strength, they began planning their counterattack. Hidden in their mountain refuge, she drew detailed maps on pieces of bark, with a charred stick, marking locations and revealing the full scope of Morrison's criminal enterprise. "It's not just gun running," Clara explained, sketching the layout of a fortified ranch house 30 miles south of Deadwood. Marcus discovered they're operating a whole network: weapons to the tribes, information to the army, women and children sold into slavery, stolen gold from stage robberies. Jeremiah studied her crude but detailed drawings. "How many men?" "Morrison keeps at least 20 fighters at the main compound, but he also has connections with corrupt officials in 3 territorial governments. Even if we expose him, he might have enough political protection to avoid justice. Then we make sure there's no one left to protect." Clara looked up sharply from her map-making. "You're talking about killing all of them." "I'm talking about stopping a cancer that's been spreading across the territory for years. How many families have been destroyed while good people looked the other way?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering the implications. "There are innocent people at the compound too. Servants, some of the women who work there voluntarily, and the captors. We can't risk their lives in a frontal assault. What do you suggest?" Clara pulled out another piece of bark and began sketching a more detailed floor plan. "Marcus spent 2 days there once, negotiating a large arms purchase. He told me the layout, described their routine. If we could get inside during one of Morrison's dinner parties, when most of the guards are drinking and relaxed, That sounds like a good way to get us both killed. Maybe, or maybe it's the only way to save the dozen women I saw being held in the basement cell. Clara's voice carried a steel edge that reminded Jeremiah why she'd survived 2 years of captivity. I won't run away and leave them to that fate. I can't. Over the following days, they refined their plan with the careful attention to detail that their lives would depend on. Clara's knowledge of the compound's layout proved invaluable, but they needed current intelligence about guard rotations, escape routes, and the location of the captives. There's someone who might help, Clara said reluctantly. A woman named Marie, who works in Morrison's kitchen. She was captured with me initially, but Morrison kept her for himself instead of selling her. She might be willing to provide information if she knew someone was coming to help. How do we contact her without alerting Morrison? There's a trading post about 5 miles from the compound. Marie goes there every Tuesday to buy supplies. If we could intercept her there. The trading post was little more than a shack beside a creek crossing, run by a grizzled old-timer who asked no questions and minded his own business. Jeremiah and Clara arrived before dawn on Tuesday, positioning themselves where they could observe without being seen. Marie appeared at mid-morning, a small, dark-haired woman who moved with the careful caution of someone who'd learned to anticipate violence. When she emerged from the trading post with her basket of supplies, Clara stepped into her path. "Marie," she said softly. "It's Clara Whitfield. Do you remember me?" Marie's eyes widened with shock and fear. "Clara, but you're dead," Morrison said. She looked around frantically, as if expecting armed men to appear. "You have to get away from here. If they find you..." "I'm here to help," Clara said urgently. "This is Jeremiah McKenna. He saved me and now we want to save the others, but we need information about the compound." Marie studied Jeremiah with the wary assessment of someone who'd learned not to trust men's motives. "Why would you risk your life for strangers?" "Because some things are worth the risk," Jeremiah replied simply. Something in his tone convinced her. Marie glanced around once more, then pulled them behind the trading post where they couldn't be seen from the trail. "Morrison's having a big dinner party this Saturday," she said quickly. "Politicians from Denver, army officers, businessmen, all the people who help him stay in operation. Most of the guards will be drinking and playing cards in the bunkhouse." "What about the women in the basement?" 12 of them now, kept in 4 cells. The keys hang on a peg in Morrison's office, right behind his desk. Marie's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "But Clara, he's been asking questions about you. Someone told him you might still be alive. He's posted a $1,000 bounty for anyone who brings you back." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. $1,000, dead or alive. He wants those bank records more than he wants revenge, but he'll take either one. As they prepared to part ways, Marie grabbed Clara's arm. "There's something else. Morrison's planning something big for next month, a raid on a wagon train carrying payroll for the territorial government. If it succeeds, he'll have enough money and influence to become untouchable. Then we stop him this Saturday," Jeremiah said grimly, "before he gets any stronger." They spent the remaining days before Saturday in careful preparation, gathering supplies and refining their strategy. Jeremiah had insisted they return to the ruins of his cabin first, hoping to salvage anything useful from the ashes. The sight of his destroyed home hit him harder than he'd expected. 15 years of careful construction reduced to charred timbers and scattered stones. His books, his furniture, his tools, all gone. But among the debris, he found his father's war tomahawk, the steel head blackened but intact. It was his father's before that, Jeremiah explained as he cleaned the weapon with reverent care. "Carried it through 3 wars. Always said it would protect the family as long as we honored what it represented." Clara watched him work, understanding that this wasn't just about having another weapon. What does it represent? Standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you, protecting those who can't protect themselves. He tested the edge with his thumb, satisfied with its sharpness. "My father would approve of what we're doing." They also needed to address Clara's appearance. Her torn dress and bedraggled state would immediately identify her to anyone connected with Morrison's operation. Using cloth salvaged from the cabin ruins and Clara's sewing skills, they fashioned a simple but respectable traveling outfit that would allow her to move through town without attracting attention. "There's one more thing," Clara said, as she examined herself in a piece of broken mirror they'd found. "If we're going to do this properly, we should be married." Jeremiah looked up from checking his weapons. "What?" "Think about it practically. A married couple traveling together draws less suspicion than a man and woman who might be running away together. And if something happens to one of us, the other would have legal standing to claim our belongings." "Clara, you don't have to. I'm not proposing out of obligation," she interrupted, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I'm proposing because I love you, and because I can't imagine facing whatever comes next without you." Jeremiah set down his rifle and looked at her directly. "Are you sure, after everything you've been through, everything that's still ahead of us?" Instead of answering with words, Clara reached into her dress and withdrew something small and golden, her mother's wedding ring somehow preserved through all her trials. "I've been carrying this for 2 years, telling myself I was saving it for when I felt human again. I feel human now, Jeremiah, because of you." They were married that evening by a traveling preacher they found in a small settlement, with 2 curious shopkeepers serving as witnesses. It wasn't the wedding either of them had imagined, but it felt right, simple, honest, focused on what mattered most. That night, in a rented room above the general store, they consummated their marriage with a tenderness that spoke of profound trust and mutual understanding. Clara had feared this moment, wondered if her experiences had damaged her capacity for physical intimacy. But with Jeremiah, she felt only safety and love. "No regrets?" he asked afterward, holding her close in the narrow bed. "Only that we didn't do this sooner," Clara replied, tracing patterns on his chest with one finger. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm grateful for tonight." Saturday arrived grey and cold, with the promise of early snow in the heavy clouds gathering over the mountains. They rode toward Morrison's compound with their weapons concealed but ready, playing the role of a married couple seeking work at the ranch. The compound was larger and more elaborate than Clara's maps had suggested. A main house built like a fortress, surrounded by bunkhouses, barns and storage buildings. Armed men lounged near the gates, but they appeared relaxed, more interested in staying warm than maintaining strict security. "Remember," Clara murmured as they approached the gate, "we're John and Mary Thompson from Colorado Springs, looking for steady work before winter sets in." The guard who questioned them was half drunk already, despite the early hour. "You picked a good day to come calling. Boss is having a big party tonight. Might need extra help in the kitchen." They were directed to the servants' entrance, where Marie met them with barely concealed relief. "Thank God you came," she whispered as she led them through the maze of corridors. "Morrison's been in a rage all week. Something's got him spooked." "What kind of something?" "Rumors that the territorial governor is finally taking notice of the complaints about missing wagon trains and settlements. Morrison thinks someone might be feeding information to the authorities." Clara and Jeremiah exchanged glances. If Morrison suspected government intervention, tonight's raid became even more critical. They might not get another opportunity. As evening approached and the dinner party began in earnest, they positioned themselves for what could be their final gamble. 12 lives depending on their courage, skill, and the hope that sometimes justice could triumph over corruption. The dinner party was in full swing by 8 o'clock. With Morrison's guests growing louder and more careless as the whiskey flowed freely. Through the kitchen window, Clara could see politicians and army officers laughing at jokes that probably involved the misery of innocent people. Marie had positioned them perfectly, Clara helping in the kitchen where she could observe the main house, Jeremiah assigned to tend the horses where he had access to multiple escape routes. The signal mirror he'd concealed in his coat pocket would flash once when the captives were secure, twice if they needed immediate extraction. "The keys are exactly where I said they'd be," Marie whispered as she passed Clara with a tray of glasses. "Morrison's in the dining room, will be there for at least another hour. But the office door locks from the inside. You'll need to be quick." Clara nodded, her heart pounding with nervous energy. She'd memorized the route to Morrison's office, counted the steps, timed the movements of the guards. But knowing a plan and executing it under pressure were different things entirely. At 9 o'clock, during the chaos of serving the main course, Clara slipped away from the kitchen. The hallways were dimly lit and mostly empty, the few servants she encountered too busy with their duties to pay attention to one more woman in a working dress. Morrison's office was exactly as Marie had described. A large room dominated by a massive oak desk, with maps and papers covering every surface. The keys hung on their peg, a heavy ring of iron that represented freedom for 12 terrified women. Clara pocketed the keys and was turning to leave when voices in the hallway made her freeze. Morrison himself, accompanied by 2 men she didn't recognize, approaching the office door. "Need to accelerate our timeline," Morrison was saying. "If the territorial government is finally taking notice, we have maybe 2 weeks before they send investigators." Clara looked around desperately for a hiding place. The desk was too low, the window too small. In desperation, she pressed herself behind the heavy curtains just as the office door opened. "The wagon train job will give us enough capital to buy legitimate businesses in Denver," one of Morrison's companions said. "After that, we can afford to be more careful about our operation, assuming we can tie up the loose ends first." Morrison's voice was cold and calculating. "That Whitfield woman is still out there somewhere, and she knows enough to destroy everything we've built." Clara's blood went cold as she realized they were discussing her as if she were already dead. "Your man said he tracked her to some mountain cabin," the second companion said. "Found evidence of a fight, blood, burned building. Maybe she's already taken care of. Maybe isn't good enough. I want proof she's dead, or I want her brought back alive so I can question her personally about those bank records." The men continued talking for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Clara remained motionless behind the curtains, barely daring to breathe, while they discussed details of their criminal operations with casual indifference to human suffering. Finally, they left to rejoin the party. Clara waited until their footsteps faded, then crept from her hiding place and slipped back into the hallway. The basement was accessed through a door near the kitchen that Marie had left unlocked. Clara descended stone steps into a space that smelled of fear, unwashed bodies, and despair. 12 women looked up as she appeared, their faces showing a mixture of hope and suspicion. "I'm here to get you out," Clara whispered, producing the keys. "But we have to move quickly and quietly." The youngest couldn't have been more than 16, the oldest perhaps 40. All bore the marks of captivity and abuse, but their eyes still held life. Clara unlocked the cells one by one, helping the weakest women to their feet. "Follow me exactly," she instructed. "No talking, no sudden movements. There's a man waiting with horses at the north pasture. If we get separated, head for the tree line and keep going north." They moved through the basement like ghosts, past storage rooms filled with stolen goods and illegal weapons. At the base of the stairs, Clara paused to listen for sounds from above. The party continued, loud enough to mask their movements. One by one, the women climbed the stairs. Clara went last, her hand on the basement door, when disaster struck. One of the rescued women, weakened by months of poor treatment, collapsed halfway across the kitchen floor. The crash of falling pots and pans echoed through the house like gunshots. Within seconds, shouts erupted from the dining room as Morrison's men realized something was wrong. Clara helped the fallen woman to her feet, just as armed guards burst through the kitchen door. There was no time for subtlety now, only the desperate hope that Jeremiah had heard the commotion and was ready for immediate extraction. She flashed the signal mirror twice through the window, praying he would see it in time. Gunfire erupted throughout the compound as Jeremiah's carefully planned diversion went into effect. He'd positioned explosive charges in the ammunition storage building, and the massive blast that followed shattered windows throughout the main house and sent Morrison's men scrambling in all directions. But the plan had called for a quiet extraction, and now they were fighting for their lives in the middle of enemy territory, with 12 terrified women who could barely walk, let alone run. "This way!" Clara shouted over the chaos, leading the rescued captives toward the kitchen's rear exit. Behind them, Morrison's voice rose above the confusion, bellowing orders to his men. "Find that woman. She's worth more than all of you combined." Jeremiah appeared at the kitchen door, his rifle smoking from recent use. "Horses are waiting, but we've got maybe 2 minutes before they organize a proper pursuit." The rescued women stumbled through the darkness toward the pasture, where Jeremiah had prepared their escape route. Some were too weak to mount horses on their own, requiring precious time and assistance that they couldn't spare. "Leave us," gasped an older woman, who could barely stand. "Save yourselves. Nobody gets left behind," Clara said firmly, helping the woman onto a horse behind one of the stronger captives. "We all go home together." Behind them, the main house was fully alert now, with armed men pouring from every building. Muzzle flashes lit the night as Morrison's guards began shooting at anything that moved, their discipline shattered by the surprise attack. Jeremiah took position at the pasture gate, providing covering fire while the women mounted up. His father's tomahawk hung at his belt alongside his rifle, both weapons consecrated by years of family honor and now baptized in the cause of justice. A blood-stained bandana around his left arm showed where a bullet had grazed him during the initial assault, but he ignored the wound as he calmly picked his targets among the approaching guards. "Clara," he shouted without taking his eyes off the enemy, "take the women and head for the tree line. I'll hold them here as long as I can. I'm not leaving you. You have to. These women need someone to guide them to safety." A bullet whined past Clara's head, close enough that she felt the wind of its passage. Around her, several of the rescued women were crying, overwhelmed by the sudden violence after months of captivity. "Listen to me," Clara told them, her voice carrying over the gunfire with calm authority. "We're going to ride hard for those trees. Stay low, follow the woman in front of you, and don't stop for anything." She looked back at Jeremiah, who was methodically working his rifle bolt, each shot claiming another of Morrison's men. "I love you," she called out. "Love you too," he replied without missing a beat in his firing rhythm. "Now go." Clara led the exodus of liberated women toward the forest, their horses pounding across the open ground, while bullets kicked up dirt around them. Behind her, Jeremiah's rifle continued its deadly work, but she could hear Morrison's men getting closer to his position. They reached the tree line just as Jeremiah's ammunition ran low. Clara turned in her saddle to see him draw his father's tomahawk and prepare to make his final stand against impossible odds. But then salvation arrived from an unexpected direction. A line of riders emerged from the opposite side of the compound. Territorial marshals and army cavalry, led by a grim-faced officer who'd apparently been investigating Morrison's operation for months. "This is Marshal Davidson," a voice boomed across the battlefield. "Lay down your weapons and surrender." The tide of battle turned instantly. Morrison's men, caught between Jeremiah's position and the approaching lawman, began throwing down their guns and raising their hands. Some tried to flee but were quickly run down by mounted cavalry. Morrison himself appeared at the main house door, his silver hair disheveled and his face twisted with rage. He spotted Clara among the rescued women and raised his pistol, determined to claim his prize even as his empire crumbled around him. The shot that followed echoed across the compound, but it wasn't Morrison who fired. Jeremiah had spotted the threat and put his last bullet through the colonel's chest, ending the criminal's reign with the precision of a man who'd spent 15 years perfecting his marksmanship. As dawn broke over the mountains, Clara rode back to where Jeremiah sat exhausted against the pasture fence, his bandana now thoroughly soaked with blood from his wound. The rescued women were safe. Morrison's organization was destroyed, and justice had finally come to the high country. But the cost of their victory was written in the drawn faces of the survivors, the burned buildings, and the blood that stained Jeremiah's clothes. Some battles were won not through strength or strategy, but through the willingness to sacrifice everything for what mattered most. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of recovery and testimony. Marshal Davidson had established a temporary headquarters in Deadwood, where Clara and Jeremiah spent long hours providing statements about Morrison's criminal network. The rescued women each told their stories, creating a comprehensive picture of an operation that had victimized hundreds of people across 3 territories. Jeremiah's wound proved more serious than initially apparent. The bullet had nicked an artery, and infection set in during their first week in town. Clara rarely left his bedside at the doctor's office, reading to him from her poetry book and helping him through the fever dreams that sometimes transported him back to the night of the raid. "You saved them all," she reminded him during one of his darker moments, when the pain made him question whether their actions had been worth the cost. 12 women are going home to their families because you were willing to risk everything." The rescued women had indeed become a source of unexpected joy during their recovery. As they regained their strength and confidence, they began working together on a project that surprised everyone, a quilt that told the story of their ordeal and liberation. Each woman contributed a square representing some aspect of their experience, from the darkness of captivity to the hope of freedom. The centerpiece was Clara's contribution, a square depicting a mountain cabin surrounded by pine trees, with 2 figures standing together in the doorway. It wasn't artistic in any traditional sense, but it captured something essential about finding home in unexpected places. "It's beautiful," said Elena, the youngest of the rescued women, as they worked together in the hotel's common room. "Like a fairy tale, but the best stories always are," Clara replied, teaching the girl a complex stitching pattern that would make her square stronger. "They start with ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things." Elena was planning to return to her family in Kansas, while others had decided to start fresh in California or Oregon. But 3 of the women, including Marie, had chosen to remain in the Deadwood area, drawn by the community that had formed among the survivors. "We understand each other," explained Sarah, a woman in her 30s who'd been captured while traveling with a church missionary group. "Out there will always be those poor women who were rescued. Here we're just neighbors helping each other build new lives." Marshal Davidson visited frequently Jeremiah's recovery, bringing updates on the investigation and prosecution of Morrison's surviving associates. The bank records that Clara had mentioned proved invaluable in unraveling the full extent of the criminal network. "We've arrested 14 men in 3 territories," the marshal reported during one visit, including 2 Army officers and a territorial judge. "This thing went all the way to the top." "What about the women who were sold before we got there?" Clara asked. "The ones we couldn't save. We're following every lead, but after years in the system, some trails have gone cold." Davidson's expression was grim but determined. "However, your testimony has already helped us shut down 2 similar operations in Colorado and Wyoming. The ripple effects of what you did will save lives for years to come." As Jeremiah's health improved, he and Clara began discussing their future with the careful deliberation of people who'd learned not to take anything for granted. The destroyed cabin represented more than lost property. It symbolized a way of life that no longer seemed sustainable or satisfying. "I keep thinking about what you said that first night," Clara mused as they walked slowly through Deadwood's muddy streets, Jeremiah still favoring his injured side. "About choosing between what's easy and what's right. What about it? Maybe the choice isn't just about individual moments. Maybe it's about how we want to spend the rest of our lives." They'd received several offers during their recovery. Marshal Davidson had suggested Jeremiah consider work as a territorial deputy, using his wilderness skills to track criminals across the vast distances between settlements. A rancher, whose daughter had been among the rescued women, offered them land and livestock as a reward. Even the territorial governor had written personally, inviting them to Denver to discuss opportunities in law enforcement or territorial administration. But the offer that intrigued them most came from an unexpected source: the Methodist Church that served the scattered mining camps and settlements throughout the region. They needed people willing to travel from community to community, providing education, basic medical care, and spiritual guidance to families living in isolation. "It wouldn't be easy work," Clara said as they considered the proposed. "Months at a time on the road, primitive conditions, people who might not welcome outsiders, but it would be meaningful work," Jeremiah replied. using what we've learned to help people instead of just surviving. The decision felt right in a way that surprised them both. After years of solitude and survival, they were ready to dedicate themselves to something larger than their own needs and desires. Their new life began with the purchase of a plot of land in a valley 20 miles south of Deadwood, fertile ground with a creek running through it and enough timber to build a proper home. But this wouldn't be another isolated cabin. Clara had insisted on a location near enough to the main trail that travelers could find them easily, and with space for the school she planned to establish. The land deed represented more than ownership. It symbolized their commitment to putting down roots in a community rather than hiding from the world. Jeremiah signed his name with careful precision, still amazed that he was planning a future that involved other people. 200 acres. Clara mused as they stood on a small rise overlooking their new property. Enough for a house, school, garden, and guest cabins for families who need temporary shelter. You've been thinking about this for a while, Jeremiah observed. Since the night we rescued those women, I kept wondering what would have happened if there had been safe places for them to go, people willing to help before things got desperate. They spent the first weeks living in a tent while beginning construction of their home. But this time, Jeremiah wasn't working alone. 3 of the rescued women had decided to settle nearby, and their husbands, men who'd traveled from distant states to reclaim their wives, proved eager to help with the building project too. The house that took shape was larger and more ambitious than Jeremiah's original cabin. A main room that could serve as both living space and classroom, with a stone fireplace large enough to warm the entire structure. Separate bedrooms for privacy and guests, a kitchen designed by Clara to handle cooking for large groups, and a cellar for storing supplies through the harsh mountain winters. But the most significant addition was the schoolroom, a bright space with large windows and built-in shelves for books. Clara had been corresponding with educators in Denver and Chicago, requesting donations of textbooks, maps, and teaching materials suitable for frontier schools. The children here deserve the same opportunities as children in the cities, she told the Methodist superintendent who'd hired them. Knowledge isn't a luxury that only wealthy families should afford. Their first students were the children of nearby homesteaders, 8 boys and girls ranging in age from 6 to 14, hungry for education but lacking access to formal schooling. Clara taught them in the mornings, while Jeremiah worked on expanding their property and learning the practical skills that frontier ministry required. But their real test came on a cold November morning when a frantic rider arrived with news that a family had been attacked by bandits on the trail between their valley and the next settlement. The father was dead, the mother wounded, and 3 children were missing. "This is what we signed up for," Clara said grimly as they prepared to leave immediately. "Are you ready?" Jeremiah strapped on his father's tomahawk alongside his rifle and medical supplies, as ready as anyone can be. They spent 4 days tracking the raiders through increasingly difficult terrain, following signs that Jeremiah read like printed text. The trail led into badlands where water was scarce and shelter almost non-existent, country that tested every survival skill they possessed. They found the children on the 5th day, abandoned in a cave when their captors decided they were too much trouble to transport. All 3 were alive but traumatized, clinging to each other and refusing to speak to the strange adults who'd come to rescue them. "It's all right," Clara said softly, approaching them with the same patience she'd shown in her classroom. "My name is Clara McKenna. This is my husband Jeremiah. We're here to take you home to your mother." The oldest child, a girl of perhaps 10, finally spoke. "Are you the people who saved all those ladies?" "Mama heard the story in town. We helped," Clara said simply. "And now we're here to help you." The journey back took 6 days, slowed by the children's need for frequent rest and careful attention to their emotional as well as physical needs. Clara told them stories, taught them songs, and gradually coaxed them back toward trust in adult protection. Their mother's tears of joy when they returned the children safely convinced Jeremiah that they'd chosen the right path. This was what their mountain ordeal had prepared them for. not just surviving in the wilderness, but using those skills to serve others who found themselves in desperate circumstances. You make a good team, Clara said that night as they sat by their fire, exhausted but satisfied with the day's work. The best. Jeremiah agreed, watching her mend a tear in one of the children's coats with the same careful attention she'd once given to teaching him poetry. Though I suspect our adventures are just beginning, the final confrontation came on a spring morning when wildflowers were just beginning to bloom in the mountain meadows. Jeremiah was teaching a group of older boys how to track deer when the lookout they'd posted on the ridge flashed a mirror signal. Riders approaching fast from the south. It had been 6 months since Morrison's death, and they'd grown comfortable in their new life, perhaps too comfortable. The man who rode into their valley at the head of 12 armed followers was Morrison's brother, Captain Eugene Morrison, late of the Confederate Army and currently wanted in 4 territories for robbery and murder. "You the ones who killed my brother?" he called out as Jeremiah emerged from the schoolhouse, his ceremonial tomahawk hanging at his side. "I'm the one who put a bullet through his heart," Jeremiah replied calmly, though he earned it 10 times over. Clara appeared beside him, her face pale, but determined. Behind them, the school children huddled in the doorway, wide-eyed with fear. "My brother built something magnificent in this territory," Captain Morrison continued, his voice carrying the cultivated accent of Southern aristocracy, corrupted by years of violence. "A network that provided services people wanted: excitement, opportunity, freedom from the constraints of law and morality. Your brother was a slaver and a murderer," Clara said firmly. "Whatever he built was paid for with innocent blood." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "There's no such thing as innocence, schoolmom. There's only power and weakness, predator and prey." My brother understood that. Around the valley, other homesteaders were emerging from their cabins, some carrying weapons, others herding their children towards safety. These were families who'd found refuge in the community that Clara and Jeremiah had helped build, people who deserved protection from the kind of evil that Morrison represented. "What do you want?" Jeremiah asked, though he already knew the answer. "Justice for my brother's death, the return of property that was stolen from our organization, and the elimination of witnesses who might testify against our remaining operations." Morrison's hand rested casually on his pistol grip. "Starting with you two." But Jeremiah had spent months preparing for exactly this possibility. At his subtle signal, concealed riflemen among the homesteaders took aim at Morrison's men. The valley that appeared defenseless was actually a carefully prepared kill zone, with overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. "You're outnumbered and outgunned," Jeremiah said quietly. "Take your men and ride away. This is your only warning." Morrison's eyes narrowed as he assessed the situation, finally noticing the glint of rifle barrels among the buildings. "Clever. But you've made one mistake. You've given me a target that matters more than tactical advantage." Before anyone could react, Morrison drew his pistol and fired at Clara. The bullet took her in the shoulder, spinning her around and dropping her to her knees. Jeremiah's roar of rage echoed across the valley as he charged Morrison with his father's tomahawk, raised high. The battle that followed was brief, but vicious. Morrison's men, caught in crossfire from the hidden settlers, began falling immediately. But Morrison himself was a skilled fighter, meeting Jeremiah's assault with a cavalry saber that rang against the tomahawk's steel head. "She was going to die anyway," Morrison taunted as they circled each other. "At least this way it serves a purpose." Jeremiah said nothing, focused entirely on the deadly dance of combat. This wasn't the wild fury that had driven him during their mountain flight. This was cold, calculated violence honed by years of survival and sharpened by righteous anger. Morrison was good, trained by professional soldiers and seasoned by years of warfare, but he'd never faced a man fighting for something more important than his own life. When Jeremiah's tomahawk finally found its mark, splitting Morrison's skull with the same precision his ancestors had used to fell trees, It carried the weight of every family that had been destroyed by the Morrison brothers' greed. The surviving raiders threw down their weapons and begged for mercy, but the homesteaders were in no mood for half measures. These men had come to murder children and teachers, to destroy the peaceful community they'd worked so hard to build. As the sounds of battle faded, Jeremiah knelt beside Clara, pressing his hands against her wound to stop the bleeding. Her eyes were bright with pain but clear with purpose. "The children," she whispered. "Are they safe?" "They're safe," he assured her. "You're safe. We all are." But even as he spoke the words, Jeremiah knew that safety was always temporary, always fragile. The price of building something good in a harsh world was eternal vigilance against those who would destroy it for their own end. The wedding ceremony took place on the first anniversary of Morrison's defeat, in the meadow behind their schoolhouse where wildflowers bloomed in abundance. It wasn't their first marriage. That hasty ceremony before their final raid had been born of necessity and uncertain future. This celebration was different, a renewal of vows made in joy rather than desperation, surrounded by the community they'd helped build. Clara wore a simple white dress that the other women in the valley had sewn together, each contributing fabric and labor, as their gift to the teacher who'd become the heart of their settlement. Her shoulder bore a faint scar from Morrison's bullet, but she'd recovered completely and wore the mark as a badge of courage, rather than shame. Jeremiah stood beside her in his best clothes, clean-shaven for the occasion, but still unmistakably the mountain man who'd sacrificed everything to save a stranger. His father's tomahawk hung at his side, not as a weapon of war now, but as a symbol of the heritage he carried and the values he'd chosen to defend. The ceremony was performed by the circuit preacher who visited their settlement monthly, but the real benediction came from the children. Clara taught. They'd prepared a song, a simple melody with lyrics they'd written themselves about finding family in unexpected places, and learning that home was wherever people cared for each other. Among the guests were several of the women they'd rescued from Morrison's compound, now settled with families of their own throughout the territory. Marie had married a widowed rancher and established her own school in a settlement 50 miles north. Elena, the youngest of the rescued women, had grown into a confident young lady who spoke passionately about becoming a teacher herself. "You saved my life," Elena told Clara during the reception. "But more than that, you showed me that surviving isn't enough. You have to decide what kind of person you want to be with the life you've been given." The school bell that Clara had insisted on mounting above their schoolhouse rang throughout the celebration, its clear voice carrying across the valley like a declaration of hope. Children who'd never expected to learn reading and writing now recited poetry with confidence. Parents who'd struggled alone on isolated homesteads now participated in a community that supported each other through hardship and celebrated together in joy. "Hard to believe it's only been 2 years," Jeremiah mused as he and Clara shared their first dance as husband and wife for the second time. "Feels like a lifetime," Clara agreed. "But also like we're just getting started." Their school had grown to include 23 students, with families traveling from as far as 30 miles to participate in Clara's educational programs. Jeremiah had built additional dormitory space for children whose families lived too far away to commute daily, creating what was essentially a boarding school in the wilderness. But their most significant development was still a secret shared only between them. Clara was expecting their first child, due in the early winter. They'd decided to wait until after the ceremony to announce the news, wanting to savor this private joy before sharing it with their extended community family. "What do you think our child will see when they grow up here?" Clara asked as they watched the sun set over the mountains that had once seemed so forbidding. "Hopefully a world where strength is used to protect instead of dominate," Jeremiah replied. "Where education is valued more than gold, and where people take care of each other because it's right, not because they have to." As the evening progressed, neighbors shared stories of the changes they'd witnessed since Clara and Jeremiah's arrival. Crimes had virtually disappeared as the community developed systems of mutual support. Children who'd been growing up wild and uneducated were now reading literature and solving mathematical problems. Families who'd lived in fearful isolation now participated in barn raisings, harvest festivals, and shared celebrations of life's milestones. "You two started something here," said Thomas Brennan, whose family had been among the first to settle near their property. "Not just a school or a church, but a different way of thinking about what communities can be." The celebration continued late into the evening, with music and dancing and storytelling that wove individual experiences into the larger narrative of their shared success. When the last guests finally departed, Clara and Jeremiah found themselves alone in the meadow, where they'd pledged their lives to each other and to the work they'd chosen. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing the question from their first wedding night. "Only that we can't do this again tomorrow," Clara replied, her hand resting unconsciously on her still flat belly, where their future grew in secret. Above them, the same stars that had witnessed their desperate flight through mountain caves now blessed their peaceful home, testament to the truth that even the darkest journeys could lead to destinations bright with hope and purpose. The first snow fell on the morning their son was born, blanketing the valley in pristine white that seemed to herald a new beginning. Clara labored through the night while Jeremiah paced outside their bedroom door, reduced to helplessness for the first time since their mountain ordeal began. Marie had come to assist with the birth, bringing skills learned from helping deliver dozens of babies in frontier settlements. "He's perfect," she announced as she placed the tiny, squalling infant in Clara's arms. 10 fingers, 10 toes, and lungs that could wake the dead. Jeremiah entered the room with trembling hands, overwhelmed by the sight of his wife holding their child. The baby was impossibly small, red-faced and wrinkled, but undeniably perfect in every detail. "What should we call him?" Clara asked, exhausted but radiant with maternal joy. They'd discussed names for months, but looking at their son for the first time, only one seemed right. "Thomas," Jeremiah said softly, "after my father and yours." Baby Thomas McKenna opened dark eyes that seemed to take in the world with serious curiosity before focusing on his parents' faces. In that moment, Jeremiah understood with crystalline clarity why people fought so hard to build safe places for their families to grow. The cradle had been Jeremiah's project during Clara's final months of pregnancy, crafted from the same pine trees that surrounded their valley. He'd carved protective symbols into the wood, eagles for strength, oak leaves for endurance, and a simple mountain peak to remind their son of the landscape that had shaped his parents' love story. "He'll grow up thinking all this is normal," Clara mused as she nursed their son, while Jeremiah added wood to the fire. "Children who respect learning, parents who work together for the common good, a community where everyone looks out for each other. Maybe that's the point," Jeremiah replied. "Maybe the next generation won't have to fight so hard for basic decency because they'll expect it as a natural part of life." Their school had continued operating throughout Clara's pregnancy, with older students helping teach younger ones, and community members sharing their specialized knowledge. The settlement now boasted 37 families, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and plans for a proper church building come spring. But the most significant change was less tangible, the development of what people had begun calling the McKenna way of solving problems. Instead of relying on violence or authority imposed from outside, disputes were resolved through community discussion and mutual cooperation. Children who misbehaved were corrected through additional responsibilities rather than punishment. Families facing hardship received help from neighbors who understood that everyone's welfare was connected. Word of their success had spread throughout the territory, drawing visitors who wanted to understand how a former mountain hermit and a rescued captive had created something that resembled the best intentions of civilization. Some came seeking to replicate their methods in other settlements. Others came simply to see for themselves whether such a place could really exist. "It's not perfect," Clara always told these visitors honestly. "We still have disagreements, people still make mistakes, and we're constantly adapting to new challenges. But we've proven that communities can be built on something other than fear and competition." As baby Thomas grew from infant to toddler, he became the unofficial mascot of their valley. The other children doted on him, teaching him games and songs. The adults competed to see who could make him laugh the loudest. Even the most hardened frontier men melted when he reached tiny hands toward them, with absolute trust. "He's going to be spoiled rotten," Clara observed one afternoon as she watched her 3-year-old son help Jeremiah repair a fence, while a dozen neighbors offered unnecessary advice and assistance. "Could be worse things," Jeremiah replied, lifting the boy onto his shoulders so he could see the entire valley spread out below them. "Could grow up thinking the world is a place where people can't be trusted." On evenings when work was finished and the family gathered around their fireplace, Clara would read to Thomas from the same poetry book that had comforted her through the darkest periods of her captivity. But now the words about finding beauty in simple things and discovering strength in unexpected places felt like prophecy fulfilled rather than desperate hope. The life they'd built together bore no resemblance to what either of them had planned or expected. But as Jeremiah watched his wife teaching their son to count using wooden blocks he'd carved, surrounded by the evidence of love and purposeful work, he knew that sometimes the best destinations were the ones you never thought to seek. Outside their windows, the mountains stood eternal and protective, no longer barriers to be overcome, but guardians watching over the home they'd built in their shadow.